morning, everybody, and welcome. We are pleased to be together today to mark World Food Day, a day that was established by the United Nations to recognize our human right to food. This day is especially meaningful during the many crises we are facing: the climate emergency, the COVID-19 crisis, and the issues with poverty and hunger, when many people are struggling to access nutritious food. So we're really excited to have a wonderful presentation and some discussion. But for starters, I'm going to talk a little bit about Zoom. So I'm sure this isn't your first Zoom call, but I'm going to review some of the Zoom protocol. So please mute your microphone during the presentations. Your camera can be on or off, but of course, we'd love to see your pretty faces. We'll be recording this session. We'll be here for about an hour and a half, and we're going to hear from our speaker and then have a Q&A. Use the chat for any technical issues, and post any questions in the chat as we go through, or if you want to, you can put up your hand. We'll try and sort of interject at a good time, and Michelle will also sort of perhaps ask you if people have any questions or something like that, but we want to sort of keep the flow as well, but we really want to hear from people. So those are the protocols, and I'll hand it over to Lisa.
Well, thank you for being here. Let's start us off in a good way. Creator, we are thankful for you, for your love, and for all that you have given us. You have provided for us for generations, and you have given us earth, water, the moon, the sun, seasons, tides, variety of regions, and different climates. Creator, you love diversity and have given varieties of animals, species, food, fruits, fish. Today, we just want to stop and say thank you. Thank you. Today, we also want to acknowledge that we need, as humans, to be more responsible in the caring of the earth we live on. We need to step up and learn more and be more responsible. We seek your guidance and open our hearts to your guidance as we seek to be more responsible. Thank you. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about myself. So my name is Lisa Odell. Welcome and thank you for coming. I'm a settler here on Turtle Island. I was born in Treaty 13, the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Métis. However, I grew up in Barbados, an island in the Caribbean, which was the home to the Arawaks and Caribs at the time of the arrival of the Europeans. I am of African descent. My forefathers were taken from their homelands on the western coast of Africa and sold into slavery and shipped to the Caribbean. Today, I'm coming to you from Treaty 4, where I have been living for the past 23 years on the traditional lands from Treaty 4, and I'll leave the rest for Denise to fill in. Right now, I want to share a little bit more about Right and Relations. I coordinate the Right and Relations Circle, and I'm a member of Right and Relations Canada. Right and Relations is a women-led pan-Canadian network of adult educators working for radical social change. We have been funded by the Catherine Donnelly Foundation, and now we have our own independence, so we're seeking funding elsewhere as well. We are organized in hubs across Canada, and in the West, it's Regina, Edmonton, and Winnipeg as part of the Western Hub. Montreal, Ottawa, and Hamilton and Toronto are part of the Central Hub, and in the East, the Maritime Provinces. Our priorities are to build capacity within members by supporting and providing resources for them to continue to do the work that they are already doing, and to operate in a circle, recognizing our interconnectedness and the need to share power and space equitably. We are committed to a heart-centered approach to leadership, which means that we practice the universal laws of love, respect, compassion, and empathy for all of creation. It also means that we ourselves need to do the work of being authentic and right with ourselves in the process of writing relations with others. We are radically inclusive, and our goal is to build trust and relationships, as well as a safe space to be and share some of our challenges and be supported. We embrace the reconciliation movement to right relations between Indigenous and settler communities in Canada and seek to build bridges across diverse peoples. Today, we're taking steps to right our relationship with our land and our food. And Denise will introduce herself.
Thank you, Lisa. You're welcome. So my name is Denise Mcdonald. I am the network coordinator at the Saskatchewan Council for International Cooperation. SCIC helps people act on their desire to make the world a better place. We do this by educating people about global issues such as poverty, human rights, gender equality, the climate emergency, and support people to take meaningful action. So SCIC is part of an international movement toward achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, or Agenda 2030. Working for food sovereignty supports the efforts of Goal 2, Zero Hunger, Goal 3, Good Health and Wellbeing, Goal 8, Decent Work and Economic Growth, Goal 12, Responsible Consumption and Production, just to name a few. So protecting the integrity of the food system and the people that produce our food is so important, which we've really begun to realize during the pandemic. So we thought that we would like people to put in the chat where you're from or which territory you're coming from, if you wouldn't mind putting that in the chat. And then I'm just going to do a land acknowledgement while we do that. So this land acknowledgement serves both to show respect to Indigenous peoples on whose land we live, work, and play on. We are honored to be here as guests on this land that Indigenous peoples have cared for millennia and continue to care for. We make a land acknowledgement to remind ourselves of the history and contributions of Indigenous communities. If you belong, like me, to the settler peoples who benefit from the privileges of our country built on Indigenous land, we remind ourselves of our contribution and our role in working against the colonial legacy that leads to discrimination and oppression, and recognize this as a moment of reflective discomfort. We acknowledge the harms and injustices of the past and present. We affirm our responsibility to stand with Indigenous communities who want support to protect their land and culture from further devastation. They have been on the front lines of biocide and genocide for centuries, and as allies, we should join them in a spirit of collaboration and reconciliation. We also want to take a moment to acknowledge the ongoing struggles against racism, including anti-Black racism and racism against Indigenous peoples. We want to acknowledge our need to listen to Black and Indigenous voices and challenge white supremacy. I encourage you, if you do not already know, to do some research on the original peoples where you are located. So some things you can ask are, what are the names of the Indigenous people whose land you are on? What languages are spoken on these lands? Is the territory ceded or unceded? What treaties, if any, are applicable to the territory you are on? What is your relationship to the land you are on? What do you know about the history of Indigenous peoples and their early interaction with colonizers and settlers? What current issues are of utmost importance to the Indigenous peoples whose territories you are on? What, if anything, are they asking of co-resistors for support and solidarity? And what can you do to learn more about and or build better relations with Indigenous peoples in the territory where you reside? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise, for that. I appreciate that. It really helps us to get focused and put our minds and heart on the work that we are to do. So now I want to introduce you to Michelle Brass. And I just met her a couple of weeks ago, and it is indeed a pleasure. Michelle is a speaker, a writer, and a health and wellness coach, deeply committed to the health and well-being of Indigenous people and communities. Her work is focused on the areas of Indigenous food security and sovereignty, climate change, Indigenous health, wellness, personal healing and transformation, and community well-being. She's a member of the Yellow Quill First Nation, the Saulteaux and Anishinabe in Treaty 4 territory. Michelle is also a creator of the SHAWL Program, a health and wellness program that leads people to become sustainable health and wellness leaders. And she's hoping that SHAWL Certified Facilitators within their communities. We address the aspects of in her work, she addresses the aspects of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health, rooted in an Indigenous approach to the community well-being, and lead participants to understand the direct relationship between the health and healthy of our people, of their people, and health and healing of Mother Earth, and vice versa. She serves as Executive Steering Committee for Indigenous Climate Action, a national organization that inspires action for climate justice by supporting Indigenous communities to develop Indigenous-led solutions to climate change. Welcome, Michelle.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak this morning on World Food Day and to bring a lot of these issues into greater awareness among the people joining and others who will maybe join in the recording, and just to get this information and this discussion a wider net, to get people talking about this a lot more. It's super vital to our future. So I'm just going to jump right in. Thank you, Lisa. That was a lovely introduction. I appreciate that. But I do want to jump right in so that we have a lot of time for discussion during and after. Please, thank you for mentioning the questions in the chat and speaking up. Normally when I give presentations in person, I always say that I prefer to have a discussion, an interactive discussion, as opposed to me standing on stage or me being the presenter in a Zoom, just talking. I really like to have some interaction, because really this is all about sharing ideas, supporting and inspiring one another to create that change, and we all do it together. So feel free, as I'm speaking, to either raise your hand or put something in the chat. I may not be checking the chat too much as I go through the slides and keep us on time. But if something is really, if you're just burning to ask the question during, let's do that. Otherwise, keep them as they come up, and then we can address them at the end, and keep it dynamic that way. But I would really love to hear what your questions are, what your experience are, how you're contributing to this conversation and this issue, because it really does require all of us sharing all of our ideas, expertise, and very generous one another. So, so I'm going to get started here. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and let's see if I'm doing this correctly. I'm going to start. How is that? Everybody can see that? Denise, thumbs up? Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So yes, this morning I'll be speaking on food security, sovereignty, sustainability, and soil, and how all of these elements tie together, the deep interconnectedness of these issues, and what it really means for our present and our future. So food is at the center of our life and society. For all of human history, all of our societies have been built around food, whether Indigenous societies or other societies, that have sprung up over the years and over the course of human history. So food impacts all aspects of our life. It impacts our health and wellness, whether that's our personal health and wellness, the collective health and wellness of our communities, but also the health and wellness of our Mother Earth and all of creation. How we gather that food, how we produce that food, where it comes from, the relationships that we develop, really impact all aspects of health and wellness. So we look at environmental concerns, conservation, science. Food is connected to all of these elements. The agriculture industry, food production is a major driver of our local and worldwide economies. You just look at all of the food production worldwide, all of the trade, all of the transport, all of the policies, and that leads us into politics at all levels of government worldwide, local policy, world trade agreements, food, again, when we're looking at things like NAFTA or China-Canadian relations, whether we're looking at whether a local municipality allows backyard chickens, all aspects of policy will be impacted by our food choices and how we consume and produce our food. Then we look at climate change. The industrial agriculture industry is a major driver of climate change when you look at greenhouse gas emissions coming from cattle production, monocrop production, large-scale agriculture, landfills, when food waste is produces methane. And so there's this whole, the transport of food. When we're buying oranges from South Africa that are in the grocery store in Treaty 4 territory, the transport of that fruit contributes to the greenhouse gas emissions and to climate change. So we really need to look at the food industry when we're looking at the drivers behind climate change, but also the solution to climate change. And that's what we'll talk about today, is when we really look at this area that is central to all life in society. It's causing a lot of problems right now, but we can flip that and look at how it can be a solution and how we can mitigate some of the climate effects that we're looking to see through how our food is produced. Also, culture and identity tied to food all around the world. Cultures are rooted in the food, the animals, the plants, the preparation of food, the ceremony around food, the feasting, first foods for children. Food, again, becomes part of our culture and that interwoven relationship we have with one another and the land. And then going into land ownership and territory. So we recognize the territories that we're currently living in, where we're from. And then there's also the worldview of, can you own land, or are you a guest on the land? Do you have a relationship with the land? So we look at a lot of Indigenous societies and our worldview on that relationship or responsibility to the land, and contrast that with the idea of ownership over the land, purchasing land, controlling territories, and that kind of thing. And it comes down to food again. And you look at the state of Canada and how, the building of the railroad to clear the plains, to get farmland, to produce that for the growing nation. So again, you can look around that all over the world. Okay, okay, there we go. So talking about food and food being at the central of all of our society, it's something that we all need, right? So we can look at the economy, the environment, but every day we need to eat food. And so it comes right down to the personal experience that each of us is living. And unless we're on a fast, and that is a very short-term choice that we might make, we're going to need to have food every day. And so I want to talk about the idea of food security. So food security, one of the definitions, and you can find this on the Dietitians of Canada website, is defined in North America as a situation in which all community residents can obtain a safe, culturally acceptable, nutritionally adequate diet through a sustainable food system that maximizes self-reliance and social justice. The underlying is my emphasis, because we want to look at culturally accessible, nutritionally adequate, a sustainable food system that maximizes self-reliance and social justice. So food security goes a lot deeper than we may think, but it's very important that we have a culturally acceptable food system. That means it's diverse. That means it's appropriate for all people, that our nutrition comes from that. So it's not just about calories. It's not just about amounts of food. It's about quality of food, making sure that we can meet our nutritional needs. So we can explore that a little bit deeper, but I am going to move quite quickly through these slides because of time. So if you want to expand on any of these ideas, let me know and we can explore that further. But really, when I bring up food security, the biggest thing I want people to realize is that it refers to the ability to access and buy food to meet nutritional needs. So one, you have to have access to the food. Is that food available to you? Do you live in a town? Do you live in a city? Do you have transportation to get to the grocery store? Are you living in a rural community? Are you living on reserve? Where do you need to travel to get your food? So is the food available in your community? And if it is not, do you have the means to travel there? Do you have a vehicle of your own? Can you afford gas to get there. If you're living in a northern community and you're reliant on an ice road to get transport of food into your community, is that ice road viable, or is it melting due to climate change? So what kind of access to food do you have available to you? And is it nutritionally adequate food? So not shelf-stable food that has calories and will last a long time, but is it a living, vibrant food that is going to nourish your body, feed your cells, and give you optimal health? If you have access to it, can you purchase it? Can you afford that food? So you might have access to the food, it might be there for you, but you can't actually access it because you can't afford the cost of that food. And so that could be because of transportation, that could be because of the price of food. And so particularly in northern communities where the food is transported, we see exceptionally high prices for food. And so that pushes it out of, it creates it a situation of being inaccessible to a large amount of people, or if you're in a remote community, not being able to access that food. And we're going to see more and more of this. Food security is going to be a very important and vital issue as we look at the impacts of climate change, as we look at the impacts of supply chain issues that we're experiencing right now worldwide. There's all sorts of reasons that food security can be impacted. So you may be food secure now, but will you continue to be food secure? And even if you are food secure, other people are not. And we are living in a collective society. So how are we making sure that the people around us, our relatives, our community members will have access to that? So food security is something that we all need to be thinking about, which leads into food sovereignty. We need to be thinking about it. We can't just be outsourcing food to government leaders and multinational corporations. We all need to take an extremely active role in the production of our food and get active in this whole industry because it impacts every single one of us, and we need to be involved in that. So food sovereignty is related to food security, but it is different. So food security, really having access to food, being able to meet your nutritional needs. Food sovereignty is related to this. It's the right of peoples to have a healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agricultural systems. So food sovereignty means that we need to be able to define our systems. And I speak a lot about Indigenous food sovereignty because our food pathways and systems are different from the global food system that we're experiencing right now, which we don't have a lot of control over or say in. And so food sovereignty means that we have that. And so that applies to all people around the world, whether you're a farmer in India, whether you're a hunter-gatherer of Indigenous ancestry in Treaty 4 territory, whether you're a farmer or a gardener, we all have to have access to food in a way that makes sense for us. So if you look at foodsecurecanada.org, this is how they define food sovereignty. Focusing on food for people, as opposed to, say, food for cattle, when you're looking at corn and soy and other feed crops. We build knowledge and skills. A lot of us have lost our knowledge and skills on food production because we've outsourced that. So the canning knowledge, the food preservation knowledge, understanding how to deal with certain issues when we're creating and when we're planting and growing food. We also want to work with nature, not against nature. We value food providers, localized food systems, putting the control locally. So making sure that we know where our food is coming from, that we really respect and revere our food producers, and that it's working within our local and natural ecosystems. And then finally, food is sacred. So these are the 7 elements of food sovereignty defined by Food Secure Canada. I am, again, going through these slides very quickly. So if there's something here that you want to expand on, let me know in the chat or at the end of the presentation. Because I could go on about some of these. This is my jam, food sovereignty, security. I love talking about these issues. I do want to touch on Indigenous food sovereignty, as it does differ from more of a mainstream view. So if you look, this is coming from the Indigenous Food Systems Network out of British Columbia, out on the West Coast. And these are the 4 elements for Indigenous food sovereignty. And I'm bringing this up because Indigenous food sovereignty is going to be key for all people worldwide as we face climate change, that we restore these food pathways, because it's about working with nature and understanding those deeper relationships. And so we're all going to have to pay attention to what does this mean and how can we participate and support this area. So the number one thing with Indigenous food sovereignty is that food is sacred and should be treated as such. We pray over our food. We pray when we gather our food. We give thanks to the animals who have gifted themselves to us so that we can consume them and make our bodies strong. Food is sacred and should always be treated as such. That is central to any food sovereignty initiative when it's with Indigenous food pathways. Participation in land-based food activities is vital and requires an action-based approach. So what this means is that we need to be active in gathering or producing our food. And so whether that's hunting, whether that's gathering, digging roots and finding medicines, whether that is planting a garden, picking berries, it's all very land-based, and you have to participate in it. You can't just go purchase it at the grocery store. I mean, we do purchase, you can purchase some farm bison, you can purchase some wild rice that has been harvested by others, but they are on the land doing that. Somebody is doing that. And when it comes to Indigenous food sovereignty, it's really about that relationship. Is it done in a way that honors the food as being sacred? So were there prayers put down? Were the proper protocols followed? Self-determination of food systems is critical, meaning that we need to determine our own food systems. And that is something that has been very difficult and puts us in a position of having to fight laws that are put in place to keep us from accessing lands, gathering food, sharing food. That food has been used against us as a weapon for the colonization of Canada. And this is happening worldwide too. It's not specific to North America and Turtle Island. All around the world, Indigenous food producers, Indigenous peoples, their lands and territories are under pressure for large-scale agriculture industry. So policy reform is also a huge part of Indigenous food sovereignty because we need to challenge laws. So often people have found their way in Canadian courts by hunting and gathering on traditional territories that may be a dispute of whether we have access to that. Is it considered private land? Is it crown land? Is it, do we have the right to be there is the question. And so we are always pushing on that to determine our own food systems. And so we're coming up against laws that are not our own that have been imposed on this land. And so it's a political stance when you're advancing Indigenous food sovereignty. Okay, so I want to talk briefly here about the role of colonization when it comes to food sovereignty, because again, not only in North America, you can see examples of this worldwide. But speaking from the area that I come from, I'm a member of Yellow Quill First Nation in Treaty 4 territory. I live in the Capel Valley in Treaty 4 territory. So I'm speaking from the lands that I live on and that my ancestors have lived on. So we look here, going way back to the extermination of the buffalo. When you look at food being used as a weapon to clear the plains of Indigenous peoples to make room for agriculture and the settlement for the development of Canada. So again, going through this very quickly, the extermination of the buffalo, it also led to the reserve and pass system. So removing the buffalo in that food source, incarcerating Indigenous peoples onto reserves, not allowing them to leave without permission. So being held there against our will, being given food rations, not having access to our traditional foods, and instead being given foods that were shelf stable that cause chronic disease like diabetes, obesity. So we're looking at flour, sugar, salt, lard, those kinds of things as food rations over the years. We also lost a lot of our knowledge during the residential school era, which has got a lot of focus right now. People need to realize that residential schools are a part of a much larger strategy to gain access to the land. And it was a very effective strategy, unfortunately. But we lost that knowledge of transferring to our children, or learning from our mothers and our aunties and our fathers and our uncles how to gather food, hunt food, how to skin, how to prepare the food. All of that knowledge transference was disrupted because our families were ripped apart. We also had malnutrition in the residential schools and experimentation. The work of Ian Mosby is looking into nutritional experiments done on children in residential schools. And then we look at what was the purpose. It was to make way for industrial agriculture, for farmland, for settlers, and really led the way to this extractive industry that we see around the world and all around us. I drive, I see it everywhere around me, right? We all do. This resulted in a loss of natural habitat for traditional foods, for the animals, for the fish, for all the little critters. All of the life that works together to create this vibrant food system for us has all been impacted by that. And then we look now at current laws restricting access to land and foods. As Indigenous peoples, we don't have access to the lands like we should and have had for millennia because of no trespassing laws, the loss of more and more crown land that we can have access to, increasing amounts of private property. And it's not just Indigenous peoples, all peoples too. When we look at like what is the land that is held in the commons, what can we all have access to? So we're all facing this, not just Indigenous peoples, but we experience that in a much different acute way, but it impacts all of us. And then that leads into climate change. When you look at the food industry, and I had mentioned earlier, it's one of the major contributors and drivers behind climate change. So you just look at colonization around the world. I gave some examples from our local area. And if you're joining us from other parts of Canada or North America, you can look to see how that has played out in your region, in the territory that you're currently living in. But we look at this around the globe. You see this happening in South America, in India, Africa. Everywhere around the world, colonization has really impacted Indigenous food systems, Indigenous communities and cultures, how we relate to that land, and the devastation that we've seen as a result of certain food practices, especially since like post-World War II, and how that mindset of taking from the land and not working with nature has resulted in some serious consequences that we're all facing now. So we really need to look at restoring Indigenous food systems that respect those natural laws and ecosystems, those relationships of those regions for sustainability. So not just in Treaty 4 territory or Treaty 6 territory or Treaty 1 territory, but in Africa, in India, in South America, in Australia, all around the world, because food production, we're going to find out as we experience the impacts of climate change, we will have to work within our local ecosystems and not just have a one-size-fits-all global food system that doesn't work with each different ecosystem. And this is important because we can't have food sovereignty if we're not sustainable. That food sovereignty is a long-term choice. So I can't be sovereign this year and go and gather berries and go hunt certain animals if I'm not careful to make sure that those habitats are in place for next year and 5 years down the road and 10 years down the road, so that when I teach my son these skills, I need to know that those ecosystems will be intact long-term. And not just intact, but we need to talk about regenerating what has been lost and destroyed. So food sovereignty leads into sustainability. It needs to be sustainable. So briefly looking at the impacts of climate change when we're looking at food production, it impacts all sorts of areas and is the crisis of humanity, right? So I'll briefly talk about how this is going to impact food. But we're looking at water as a main experience, as how we're going to experience climate change. So we look at glacier melt, rising sea levels around the world. Flooding and drought is really what I like to focus on when it comes to the food production and how we're going to be experiencing climate change. I mentioned ice roads, so the melting of ice roads and having that access to food because we have a global food system that requires major transport to different regions. The evaporation of large bodies of water that impacts the water cycle, and of course our growing cycles for food. And so drier lands and drought is going to mean more forest fires, loss of habitat for all life forms, so not just large game animals, but loss of habitat for all life that is required, because again, it's an interconnected system. To have a healthy ecosystem, you need that biodiversity. We're looking at temperature change impacting plants and animals, drier growing seasons, the need for more irrigation, but looking at the loss of water and not having access to that water and then taking it from different regions. It's just that the impacts are vast and deeply interconnected. We're all going to be facing this. And so when we look at climate change and we look at the extinction risk for climate change, it's very, very drastic. So I'm going to go through this. This slide often gets me quite emotional because these are our relatives, these animals. These are not just animals separate from us. In an Indigenous worldview, these are all of our relatives, the birds and the reptiles and all of them. So when we're talking about extinction, we're losing our relatives. So this comes from Harvard University, from the Biodiversity and Human Health Department. And they say climate change alone is expected to threaten with extinction approximately 1/4 or more of all species on land by the year 2050, surpassing even habitat loss as the biggest threat to life on land. Species in the oceans and in fresh water are also at great risk from climate change. So 25%, 1/4 of all species on land by 2050, that is less than 30 years away. So what does that mean for our children? What does that mean for us? What does that mean for our grandchildren? What does that mean for all of our societies around the world? I mean, I can't even fathom what this looks like. It's apocalyptic. And it's very scary. And so I don't like to go scare people, but we also have to open our eyes and look at what we're facing, because the solutions that will be required to even mitigate what's coming will require all of us to take action. And if we're complacent, we're just going to keep going down this road, and it's going to require all of us to take some action. And so I don't like to inspire by fear. I do like to inspire by hope. So stick with me. We're going to get there. Okay. So there's kind of the dire reality of what we're facing. But there's a great opportunity. There is an amazing opportunity when we look at climate change through an Indigenous lens. The thing that we need to remember is that, there's the science, there's the politics behind what's happening with climate change. As Indigenous peoples, we were given original instructions on how to live on the land, how to live in relationship on the land. The animals that gifted themselves to us for our bodies to thrive, and the plants that look after us, and they love us, and we love them. And there is this deep, deep relationship that goes back millennia, and all of the teachings and all of the stories. And these original instructions are vital because there are consequences to breaking natural law. And we have natural laws that we were not to step over. And when you look at modern industrial agriculture, it violates all of those rules and leads to consequences. And so what we're being told is that climate change is a consequence of breaking natural law. And so it's really important that we look at, so it's calling on us to remember those original instructions. So why am I talking about Indigenous food sovereignty, specifically to a group that may not be primarily made up? Well, because around the world, we all have those original instructions on how to live within those ecosystems that will require us to remember and to live in right relationship again. And so there is this opportunity. Climate change is a crisis that's calling on us to remember who we are and where we fit in to the larger world of creation. So that wasn't on the slide, but I thought it was quite important to bring up, because this is going to impact our food security, right? So we're talking about increased prices of food. So we see a lot of high prices right now, but those are going to continue to go up. So gas prices just recently went up. So people are complaining about how much it's going to cost to fill their truck tank or their car tank or whatever. Well, you look at transport of semis and trucks and the gas and the diesel that's required for that. I mean, that is impacted. So the cost of transporting food goes up. The inputs that's required for industrial agriculture, that goes up, and that's going to increase the price of food, which increases our risk of being food insecure. Really quickly, other potential climate change impacts that we can see is political disruption, which we've already seen worldwide. If you look at the Syrian war, and you really look at the history of it being a climate-induced war, of the drought that happened in the rural areas, and a lot of people that were forced to leave their land and go into the cities, which sparked civil distress. And you start to look at this, and this has been predicted for decades now, that we are going to be seeing this kind of disruption around the world. We see migration as people move from one region to another, and border crossing. So we saw everything that was happening in South America and going to the border, and all the horrendous things that happened down in the US as people were seeking asylum and trying to get away from a desperate situation. We can see water wars coming, food shortages, starvation, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So worldwide, we're going to see devastating impacts as a result of climate change. So this is why sustainability in our food systems is going to be key for the future of our survival, because we're seeing it now. Disease and sickness. This is an old slide from a number of years ago. We were told that there was a sickness coming, right? And we're all in this global pandemic right now. And there is talk of other pandemics to come and other sicknesses, because we are not living in right relationship with the world anymore, not adhering to those original instructions. And again, food production is at the center of all of these issues when we look at it from a modern global context. Okay, so briefly again on the food system. So we see massive crops grown all around the world elsewhere. You know, a lot of the crops that I see in Treaty 4 territory that are being grown here will not stay here. They will be exported to different regions. And there's nothing inherently wrong with trade. Indigenous food pathways, we had our trade routes. Food was a currency. We did do trade with other nations. That in and of itself isn't the problem. But it's how we're growing this food on such a massive scale that destroys the biodiversity of our local ecosystems. So those old trade routes, those all honored that. And we had this you know, so we had this trade network that really benefited everybody. And this has been benefiting up to a point that it's not sustainable, and it has been benefiting everybody because it's destroying a lot of local ecosystems. So large machinery, pesticides, herbicides, in order to take more from the land, especially if you're looking at crops that require a lot of fertilizer, because we're not honoring the soil. So we're going to go from sustainability into soil here pretty soon. You know, and then again, swollen grocery stores around cities and towns, it's about that access to food, food security. Do we have access to that food? And the thing about a global food system is that we're really dependent on the system, right? If we don't revitalize our local food systems, we're really dependent on this system, which is highly vulnerable to disruptions. So whether it's a bad crop from weather destroying crop through hail or drought or flooding, it's vulnerable to the economy, whether stocks are up or down, and how that impacts the different areas of various industries, politics. You know, I remember China shut down any of their imports from Canadian canola, and how that, or you look at NAFTA trade agreements in North America and the politics around our food system and trade. And right now we're seeing a supply chain crisis around the world, right? So there's a bit backlog, and this impacts because our food is transported through these routes as well. So we do see that we're quite vulnerable when something happens around the world. If we don't have a local food system in place to support our needs, that we are vulnerable to things happening worldwide. And we've outsourced our food to corporations. We are disconnected from our food supply and production. We are thought of as consumers now, as opposed to producers. We all used to be food producers. We all used to produce our food from raw materials, and we don't do that anymore. So I mentioned all of these things here, so I'll just go through here or skip past this. But I mentioned NAFTA, crop failure. I don't know if you guys had noticed the price of vanilla. I mean, vanilla is not a vital food, right? Like it's a luxury item. But vanilla went from like a $6 bottle at Costco to $40 in like a matter of a year because of a crop failure in, I believe in Madagascar, right? So you look at this global food system and how a crop can be affected. And so if you look at other crops that we do deeply rely on, we can just see how vulnerable we are to crop failure, oil prices going up, extreme weather, California experiencing their drought, and then needing to irrigate, and how that impacts other water tables and the whole water system there. So again, food security is threatened by that. And then the global food system that we currently have is a major driver of climate change. So we're looking again at sustainability. It's heavy on fuel and fertilizer and inputs that contribute to climate change. Agriculture and agribusiness contributes to climate change through CO2 emissions, methane. If we look at fertilizer, potash, I'm coming from Treaty 4 territory, which is in what's called Saskatchewan. Potash is a major part of our economy here. And the mining of potash is very water intensive. And it goes into a fertilizer. And basically what we're doing is we're demanding more and more from the earth without replenishing, just making it give more and more. The transporting of food contributes to global greenhouse gas emissions. And then food waste is huge. When you look at the methane that is released from landfills, and that is a huge part. So again, food security, are we distributing the food properly? Do we have a say in that through our sovereignty? Is that sustainable, or is it creating a global crisis, and how can we address that? So this comes from the World Food Day, from the website there. Biodiversity is suffering, and soils are being degraded as a result of intensified agriculture, a growing consumption of resource-intensive foods, and the conversion of natural ecosystems for crop production or pasture. So that previous slide I just addressed with all of the inputs that contribute to climate change with the current system that we're looking at. You know, a lot of it is to produce monocrops, you know, just a whole crop of canola, you know, like, so we're not seeing the biodiversity in that whole area of land of everything that's needed to regenerate soil. So the biodiversity is suffering because when we put pesticides and herbicides on that, I mean, like every life creature has a role to play. So all of the bugs, all of the critters, like creation didn't make anything that wasn't useful or didn't have a role to play. And so when we take actions that really threaten that biodiversity and throw that ecosystem out of balance, there are serious consequences to that, and we're seeing them today. So biodiversity is suffering, soils are being degraded as a result of this system. So let's look a little bit into soil. So we've covered, I'm going to check the chat. I see 5 in the chat. Here, let me just see where we're at. Is there any questions that I need to answer right now, or am I good to keep going until the end?
You're good to keep going.
Going till the end? Okay, great. Just wanted to take a quick stop there. So, so I explored food security and what that means, food sovereignty, of us having control over our food systems, and that sovereignty relies on sustainability, and really looking at that sustainability through a climate change lens, through will this work with natural systems and ecosystems so that we can rely on it 10 years, 50 years, for 100 years and more. And then that brings us to soil, which has become a great area of interest for me as I go down this path of food security and sustainability and sovereignty, because it comes back again to the natural ecosystems and how does it all work together, and what really makes everything thrive and vibrant and work as nature had intended. And that goes back to the soil. So exploring a different way, and I've really picked on the global food system, and it's more of a mindset of a large scale extractive system that does not take into consideration local ecosystems, local communities, the rights of people, of animals, of the rights to the water, the rights to the critters in the water, and all of those elements. So we need to look at another way that really does restore relationships, not just relationships between people, but relationships between our communities, but between Mother Earth, between all of that that produces life, because we rely on it, it relies on us. It is this beautiful, beautiful symbiotic relationship, and we need to honor that. So if we look at a different way of looking at food production, we can consider elements like holistic management, mixed farming, which is like organic and stacked farming, regenerative farming. So just look into, I'm not going to go really deep into these because again, I'm trying to just give the big picture here, but we can look into some of these different areas for exploration depending on where you're based, because what's going to work in your region, every ecosystem is different. So what's going to work in Treaty 4 territory is going to be different from what works out on the West Coast or out in the Canadian Shield or in Northern or Arctic communities. So we all have to look at what's going to work within our own ecosystem. So holistic management, Alan Savory is the founder, so I would highly recommend looking into his work of regenerating soil, going to different regions worldwide that are experiencing desert. I'm having a hard time with my words today, but the land turning into desert, desertification. Thank you, forgive me. But really taking, soil that has become dirt, that just blows off, that doesn't have that universe of microorganisms that give it life, and how do you restore that? So look into his holistic management model, and a lot of people are starting to look into that as a viable, sustainable way. But a lot of these will require a whole paradigm shift worldwide, right? Like it is a huge task to undertake, but that's what we're here to do and get the ball rolling on that. And the whole idea here is that everything is interconnected. So again, it falls in line with our original instructions as Indigenous peoples that we know is how to live a good life that will last for generations and beyond. Understanding the role that all life plays, that each part benefits the whole. So it's not just a taking and a taking and a taking of extracting more until there's nothing left, but it's a receiving and a giving and a sharing, and it's a very different way of looking at food production, at relationships, and at community health and well-being. It builds healthy soil. So you look at how the plants and the animals work together to strengthen that soil, to build thick green grass, which plays a huge role with carbon sequestration around the world, which is what we're going to need to mitigate the effects of climate change and to produce a sustainable, regenerative food system. So we look at healthier healthier animals, which lead to healthier people and a healthier planet, and the healthier plants and the waters. It all really works together. So this is something I like to look at. Let me just make sure. Okay, good. So regenerating the soil is really key to the holistic management approach to farming. And there's also regenerative farming, no-till farming as well is gaining traction. And John Deere even makes no-till and machinery that, and so it's happening, and people are talking about this more, and getting natural grazers onto the soil. These types of methods will help build the soil and plant growth, which is vital for climate mitigation, for the health of these ecosystems, for good food for us, for all life. It impacts the water cycle. So when you have soil that is covered by vibrant, thick plant life, when it rains, it absorbs into the soil, as opposed to having exposed soil where the water then just runs off and evaporates quite quickly. So when we look at climate change and droughts and flooding, we're going to make sure that when it rains, the rain stays where it needs to be so that it feeds the soil, feeds the plants, as opposed to just running off and evaporating. And then it contributes to this cycle where we're seeing life being deeply impacted by that. So cover crops, no bare soil, having biodiversity, and no monocrops. So really looking at a different way of farming. So soil is central to sustainability, which I'm really wanting to explore this a lot more and hear this conversation really gain some traction. So we look right now at the farming situation that we have worldwide, and we see a lot of separation between animals and plants. So cattle farming or feedlots, and then crops that are a food source for those animals. So we have a system right now where we are growing these crops as feed for the cattle, and we grow it here, and then we put the cattle over here, and then we grow that, and then we feed them. But like if we combine them, it leads to a much different outcome. Now, and I'm talking generally about some of the things that are happening down in the US as well. I mean, there's many different approaches and things that are happening in farming when we come to pasturing cattle and that kind of thing. But when you look at the holistic management model, it really goes deep into connecting the cattle and the crops or the plants and the animals for the purpose of building soil. And so that's the key that I want to get to. And we separate those two in any form around the world. It contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, cattle with methane, and then crop production with carbon, with all of the inputs through gas and oil. So you get greenhouse gas emissions from a lot of the current methods that we're using, but when you combine them, you get the soil and the grass growth will sequester the carbon. And so then you're absorbing those greenhouse gas emissions into the soil as opposed to releasing them. And really, we're needing to look at increasing grasslands right around the globe as a way of addressing climate change and allowing all the other life forms to thrive, because they have a right to life as well. It's not about us humans, and we're forgetting that, and we're seeing the consequences of forgetting that. So it's really about creating healthy ecosystems for all life to thrive. So I'm mentioning cattle right now because cattle, a lot of people are familiar with cattle. You can change from one model and try to look at this other one using that. But I definitely want to bring up restoring Indigenous food pathways as something that we all need to consider, not just those who are in the Indigenous food sovereignty movement like myself and my colleagues, but all people who are concerned about a vibrant, healthy future that has wonderful food, a vibrant ecosystem, because we're going to need that. And restoring Indigenous food pathways around the world will be key. It's going to address food security, sovereignty, the sustainability aspect, soil worldwide. If we conserve local ecosystems and natural habitat that are homes to native species, again, we're working with nature, we're working with that local ecosystem. It is perfection. We don't need to go and change anything. We just need to work with it and be in relationship with it. So looking at natural grazers and looking at bison and bringing back the buffalo into North America, there's this great organization, Buffalo Treaty, that are looking to bring bison back on vast tracts of land where there is a co-management and these relationships that span different nations and communities and cross borders. And it's a very ambitious vision that they have, but I would be very interested. They were a huge part of North America. The extinction of the Buffalo Nation was so detrimental to Indigenous ways of life, to our relationship with the land, to the soil health, to the health of all living creatures. Is our most sacred and beloved relative. And so to bring this back and to really look at opening those pathways again will be vital. And then you look at other areas where something similar like this, so this is a North American example, but look at Africa and different regions across that continent, what is needed there? And I mentioned Alan Savory as the founder of Holistic Management, and there's a lot of work that he's doing in other parts of the world to really bring back the tall grasses and the biodiversity that is Indigenous to those areas. So again, Indigenous food pathways worldwide, what's going to work best in South America as opposed to India, as opposed to Treaty 4 territory, as opposed to island nations. We really need to get to what's going to work locally, which requires Indigenous knowledge and all of that Indigenous science and how to operate in those systems will be really important. Okay, so taking action. So what can we do? So I've talked about food security, sovereignty, the sustainability issue, soil. Is this a problem for our politicians to take care of, for farmers and ranchers to take care of? Who needs to address this? It's all of us, right? We all need to do this. So this is the easy stuff, okay? This is kind of the stuff we've already heard before, but it's still important. So what can we do today, right? So learning to cook. And that might be really silly, but so many people don't know how to cook, and we're not teaching cooking. We're not teaching, again, how to cook from scratch or how to cook real food. So, just boiling things and heating things up is not really cooking. And I'm not knocking that. And I get that we're living in a society that has stretched us thin. So there's no judgment here. Again, it's such a vast thing because so many of us aren't cooking because we're in this this abusive capitalist society that is really hard on us to really deepen these relationships with our food and with one another, the time to do that. But start there, start learning how to cook and cooking new foods, learning where your food comes from, buying local and learning to prepare locally grown foods. Because again, it's about revitalizing Indigenous food systems, local food systems, strengthening our relationships with one another. And this is the key. People are like, okay, how do I prepare for climate change? How do I prepare for societal collapse, right? And there's like these people that are preppers. And I went down that road in my past as well. And it's going to be relationships. Who are the beekeepers that have the honey, and who knows how to grow carrots and beets really well, and who knows how to, where the little game animals are, and who knows how to do what. So learning where your food comes from and understanding and developing relationships with other people, we learn from one another, and that's where that knowledge transference comes from one another. And we have some technology as well, learning how to fillet fish, for example. You can watch some YouTube videos and stuff to learn some food skills. So we can use what we have at our fingertips or whatever we have access to. Hunt, gather, and grow your own food if you're able to. And I say that with caution because we don't have the habitat to support or the wildlife numbers to support everybody doing that. So again, what is sustainable? But what's vital and important about hunting, gathering, and growing your own food is when you do that, you develop a relationship with the land. So it's the people that are on the land gathering, hunting, and growing that understand how the land is being impacted by unsustainable practices. So the trappers up in northern Saskatchewan understanding how the land is being impacted by climate change, hunters who are losing access to land, understanding who owns the land and what are the politics around land ownership and who has access. So the people who are doing that, so the importance of it isn't just about gathering that food, but it's about having and deepening that relationship to the land. really understanding that when you go out there, then you understand, where do the Saskatoons grow? Where do the choke cherries grow? What kind of conditions do they need to thrive? You know, this year was pretty poor for Saskatoons in many regions, and a couple of years ago it was awful, but last year was a great and wonderful year. So really understanding the cycles, and then when you get out and do that, you deepen that relationship with our Mother Earth, and that's what we're really going to need, and that's part of Indigenous food sovereignty. Learning to preserve your food once you gather it, supporting local food producers and local food systems. So anything you can do to further your knowledge, to find out where you're at on this spectrum, and just keep deepening your knowledge, going down that path further and further. Reducing food waste is huge. So landfills are producing methane, which is a greenhouse gas emission, and it contributes to climate change. But instead, we could switch that around. And when we really focus on composting and building the soil, then we can sequester that carbon. And so it doesn't need to be a problem. It can be a solution. So you can start with backyard composting, or if you're in a smaller area, with vermicomposting, with little red worms. Do whatever you can to start thinking about soil sustainability, food sovereignty, food security. So that composting, that's all part of it. And I highly recommend the Kiss the Ground documentary. It's on Netflix. That talks all about all of the things that we're talking about here today. But San Francisco, they collect 700 tons of food scraps and plant cuttings every day. And they have a whole system. So they are starting to execute this on a larger scale with their city. So it's possible. So learn from other communities. We don't all have to start at the same space. We can learn from other communities that are implementing it and tweak it to fit our own communities. Okay, this is stuff that I'm really going to ask you all to consider taking action on. Becoming food sovereign. So really think about, how do you practice food sovereignty in your own life, and how are you supporting your community members and relatives and neighbors in becoming food sovereign, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So getting politically active and vocal, really understanding food policy in your community, in your local municipality, in your province or state, really understanding what are the policies in place. Find out who owns the land and who has access to it and control over it, because we're seeing more and more land being privatized and less access to crown and communal lands. And who owns it? Are they even from our local communities? Are they even from the nations that we're living in? Who owns it and has control over it? And so are they considering how it's going to impact our local communities? So you know, this stuff here that I was talking about, the like cook real food and you know, learn how to can and dry and freeze your food, all super, super important. But as you go down that path and keep going down that path, you're going to find yourself here. You're going to find yourself coming up against politics, against laws, against all sorts of barriers that we need to bust down and break through. So we need to do that collectively. So supporting land conservation organizations. So the Nature Conservancy of Canada is one such organization. There's other organizations that you can look at supporting that are looking at conserving what natural ecosystems we have left, and then restoring those, purchasing land so that they can be held in commons, or that they can be adapted to, you know, for restoring ecosystems for the future. I've highlighted this one. Support Indigenous sovereignty and access to land. Understand what the United Nations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is. That's UNDRIP. Look into it. Look into the different articles. Support Indigenous land defenders and water protectors when they're on the front lines, because we are protecting the water, the soil, access to land. When people can't access the land, I mean, you know, what's happening to us, but it'll happen to all of us. So if we're looking at changing policy, try to do that within your own governments as best you can, because every approach matters, but also stand with Indigenous peoples that are protecting those areas, because we need to preserve and push and further that initiative. Learn about local food policy, politics, get vocal and active about creating serious change, because something like what's happening in, say, San Francisco with their composting doesn't just happen. It requires lots of people sharing ideas and pushing those ideas forward. So I just want to end here quickly by saying, by acknowledging that it's World Food Day today, and the theme this year is celebrating food heroes, and really looking at sustainability, making sure people have access to foods and that people don't go hungry worldwide. So I just wanted to highlight a few of my heroes and people who are pushing, and these are the people that are doing this stuff, getting politically active and vocal, supporting Indigenous sovereignty, who's owning the land and who has say over it and why, and being questioning and getting active. And, you know, we could really learn from their example. So Winona Leduc, she's the program director at Honor the Earth on the White Earth Reservation in the United States. So I highly recommend looking into her work. She focuses on issues of sustainable development, renewable energy, and food systems. And she's working nationally and internationally to protect Indigenous plants and heritage food from patenting and genetic engineering. And so her work is vital. And there's too much to say. So go look her up, but I want to celebrate her as a food hero and somebody who is doing vital work in the world. Linda Black Elk is another person that I really look up to. She's an Indigenous ethnobotanist. She's based in North Dakota. And she is the Food Sovereignty Skills Director at the United Tribes Technical College in Bismarck, North Dakota. So if you're on Facebook or Instagram, follow her. She is always sharing her food gathering and preservation techniques and all the wild foods that you can eat and how to prepare them. And she's super enthusiastic. So again, supporting Indigenous food sovereignty, because if we're going to shift away from this system that we're currently in, who has the knowledge of the land in our local ecosystems, right? So it's really about social justice, Indigenous justice, land justice, all of these things. It's all intertwined. So I highly recommend that you look into these two people. These women are wonderful and doing incredible work. Okay, so this is something I worked on in Saskatchewan. Onion Lake First Nation had asked me a couple of years ago to do a booklet that features stories on people and communities that are addressing Indigenous food sovereignty and security. So it's full of examples of mostly grassroots initiatives of people doing things. So we talked to people who are hunters and gatherers, people who work with children and teach them hunting skills. Priscilla Satie from the University of Saskatchewan, teaching the Indigenous Food Sovereignty course, which unfortunately she's now retired from, but she just published a book recently and contributed to a larger work of Indigenous food sovereignty. And she's doing work right now working with Indigenous trappers in Northern Saskatchewan and the impacts of climate change, I believe, for the Suzuki Foundation. So she's doing incredible work. Some of it is about having food towers in northern communities where there's nothing but rocks and sand, and transport of shelf-stable food. So how do they get fresh fruit and vegetables? So they're using garden towers, or people who are doing grow tunnels, drying meat, and preserving it. So the whole purpose of this booklet was to inspire and encourage others to do the same. So you can contact Onion Lake First Nation to see if you're curious about this, to see if they can send you a copy, or I'm not too sure where they're at on publishing more. It was for local First Nations communities and Indigenous communities is who it's meant for. But I wanted to bring that up because I was talking about, say, Winona Leduc and Linda Black Elk, which are on the main kind of more of a global stage. But there are food heroes all over the place, people just quietly doing it and moving this forward. And so that's why I wanted to bring it up. So think about whatever region you're in and who might be doing similar work. And again, who is the food producer? Who are the food producers? Local food production, really building those relationships. It's all about relationship building. So that's it. That's kind of where I ended. I hope that I've been able to share some information that you found helpful and useful when it comes to understanding what is food security and sovereignty, the sustainability issue, and the role that soil plays in that. And I think the most important thing I just want to leave everybody with is that, again, it's all about relationships. When we build the soil, it's about all those little microorganisms, that universe of life that's in a handful of soil. They're all in relationship to one another, in relationship to the root systems and to the water and the water cycle. And that's in relationship to the plants and the animals and the critters that are growing there, and the bison and the grays that will walk on the land, and then how we produce that and eat that, and who knows how to do it. So it's about our relationship to one another, to learning from one another, our relationship to Mother Earth. All of these things really does require that relationship. And so if I can leave you with that, and when we come together to eat food, again, it's all in relationship. We all want to share our favorite foods. How does it taste? Who cooked it? So that's really what I'd like to leave you with today. And you can find out more about the work that I do at michellebrass.com, or if you want to reach out to me afterwards, I'm always happy to share what I've learned, because again, it's about being generous with this knowledge, inspiring and encouraging one another to make these changes in our world. So thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm really looking forward to engaging a little bit more and hearing what you have to say.